to a life of secrecy. It wasn't the gesture that mattered, Miss Marple knew, but the silent presence that accompanied it, a presence not born of obligation but of understanding. Claire had lived a life misunderstood by so many, but in death she had revealed a story that no one else could have told, a narrative woven from the threads of love, loss and unspoken truths. Now there was no veil to hide her memory, no need for protection, only the quiet peace of a life restored, a heart that had once been hidden now allowed to rest. Spring, when it finally arrived, came with a gentle warmth, and Miss Marple's garden bloomed with the same quiet enthusiasm she carried within her. The roses, pruned with patient care, began to open in their familiar sequence, pale blush first, then ivory, and finally the deep crimson that always reminded her of difficult truths, truths that festered and grew only when left unsaid. As she trimmed away a rogue stem, her thoughts, as they often did, turned to the complex nature of guilt, how it silently seeped into the corners of lives, how it twisted decisions and clung tighter than hate, casting a shadow that lasted longer than malice. Agnes had not been silenced by cruelty, Miss Marple mused, but by a paralyzing fear. Claire's return had not been for vengeance but for redemption, for the chance to set things right, and Mrs. Littimore, in her own quiet way, had not sought to destroy but to preserve what she believed could no longer be saved. Miss Marple, as she often did, reflected on the nature of truth, how it rarely arrives in grand declarations or fiery speeches, but often in the quiet folds of a veil, hidden beneath a stitch, or buried within the weight of a locket, sealed away by the years. She bent down to collect a fallen petal, its color still bright against the ground, and murmured softly to herself, "It's curious how the human heart, when burdened by its own mistakes, seeks to mend with silence, when all it truly needs is a bit of truth, and a little kindness." And so the truth emerged, not in a rush, not in a flurry of anger or dramatic revelations, but with the quiet grace of understanding long overdue. It wasn't hatred, Miss Marple thought, that had led to tragedy, but guilt, twisted and warped by time, hidden away in silence, until finally it could no longer be contained. Claire Mallory had not come to deceive, but to heal a wound no one had realized was there, a wound that had festered in the hearts of those who had been too afraid to face it. It was not vengeance that Claire had sought, nor had she intended to deceive. She had come to fulfill a promise made in the dust and shadows of a moment long forgotten, when the world had seemed to collapse around her. But now, in the quiet unfolding of time, that promise had become an act of devotion, an act so deeply woven into the fabric of what remained that it could not be unraveled. Miss Marple, as always, had listened closely, her keen eyes never missing the delicate threads of truth hidden beneath layers of silence. Justice in this case was not a matter of law or punishment. It did not wear a uniform, nor wield a gavel. No, it wore a veil, delicately stitched with the precise language of Morse code, and it returned something far more precious than any legal judgment, a name restored, a story untold for so long finally laid bare in the chapel's silent embrace. And so we are left to wonder, as the last of the village's mysteries quieten into the past, what would you have done if you had been Mrs. Littimore? Would you have shielded a painful secret, holding it close in the name of love, or would you have chosen to speak the truth, no matter the cost? And what of Claire? Was her deception a sin, or was it simply the only way the past could be heard, the only way the world could finally begin to understand? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. We are always so eager to read your reflections. Your insights don't just enrich this mystery, they help others to discover the layers and complexities that make these stories so compelling. Whether it's your own theory, your favorite moment, or a deeply personal reflection, every voice here adds warmth to our shared space of storytelling. If you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to subscribe for more mysteries in the style of Miss Marple, with hidden clues and hearts laid bare beneath layers of history. And please share this episode with a friend or family member who loves a well-crafted whodunit, wrapped in the quiet elegance of a country garden, tangled with regret, love and lost time. Thank you for being part of this journey. Until next time, where more secrets will be revealed, and more hearts quietly mended. A secret hidden deep within the shadows of time remained a terrifying truth waiting to be uncovered. By the time it came to light, the weight of hatred and pain had already claimed everything in its path. But when an innocent soul sets out to uncover the real cause of their death, not only does their life change, but an old story also emerges from the dark. This is a story that you've never heard before, and when it reaches you, it will make you question how far you're willing to bend before you understand the truth. When life's deepest wounds surface, where does the path to the truth truly begin? This is a tale that you will feel in the beat of your own heart with every word. The wind had picked up with a vengeance just before midnight, sharp and cold like a whisper through bone, carrying on its breath the scent of rain and something older, something like forgotten incense and wilted lilies. The ancient yew trees that bordered the abandoned convent grounds groaned beneath the pressure, their twisted limbs clawing at the sky as though in warning. Colonel Sebastian Halbrook, a man whose life was measured in punctuality and polished shoes, paced the path outside the estate wall with his aging spaniel, Brutus, when the first tremor of thunder broke the hush over Ravencourt Hollow. A flicker of lightning, brief but blinding, illuminated the distant silhouette of the ruined chapel, and there, framed by the crumbling archway, he saw it. A figure, motionless as if carved from stone, knelt in solemn prayer before the shattered altar. Cloaked in a veil as dark as morning velvet, the figure was eerily still, no flinch at the thunder, no turn of the head to the storm's call. Something unnatural coiled in the pit of the colonel's stomach, a dread he could neither name nor rationalize. Without another glance, he turned sharply on his heel, boots crunching over the damp gravel as he made for the village. He would return, but not alone. And not unarmed. Within the hour, he returned with young Officer Lane, whose uniform jacket hung over striped nightclothes, sleep still clinging to his eyes. By then the sky had split open. Rain crashed down like a curse, churning the soil into mud and sweeping over the broken stones of the convent as the two men stepped beneath the lich gate, now little more than a skeletal arch. Halbrook led with the precision of a soldier, gesturing to the very spot he had seen her. But the altar was bare, no figure, no veil, no sign that anyone had been there at all. They searched every corner of the ruined chapel, Lane's lantern sweeping over shattered pews, ivy-choked statues, and shards of stained glass glinting like blood in the grass. The ground, softened by hours of drizzle, bore not a single footprint, no crushed leaves, no disturbed earth. Even Brutus, usually eager to chase the faintest of scents, sniffed once and whimpered, turning away as if repelled. Could have gone another way, Lane mumbled, though both knew the ruins ended in sheer drop behind the altar. Halbrook said nothing, but the tension in his jaw was answer enough. As they retreated into the storm, he muttered to himself, "A tale, that's what it'll become morning." And by dawn, the tale had bloomed like wild hemlock through the village. In parlors and kitchens, over tea and wet boots, tongues wagged. At the manor's breakfast table, Reverend Blackwell recounted the colonel's sighting with a practiced mix of skepticism and sly intrigue. Miss Elspeth Blackwell stirred her porridge in silence while Lady Winthrop leaned forward with wide eyes and whispering lips. A nun, she declared, voice trembling between fear and excitement. Veiled, kneeling at the altar in that place of ruin, what else but a spirit? Others chimed in. A foreign pilgrim lost in the dark, a madwoman escaped from the asylum up in Moorhill. An actress rehearsing some doomed production, but none of it quite fit. And then came the stories, whispers of what the convent had once hidden, a novice who vanished during the war, and a benefactor who died under disgrace, his name struck from every ledger. Old stones remember things, Lady Winthrop said, buttering her toast with grim pride. Yet one guest remained silent throughout, Miss Eleanor Gray, whose quiet presence often escaped notice, but whose eyes missed nothing. She sat unmoved by the chatter, gaze fixed on the rain sliding down the window pane. For she, unlike the others, understood that the most telling details were always those ignored. That it wasn't the ghost that haunted her thoughts, but the colonel himself, a man too grounded in reason to be swept by shadows. That there were no footprints, though the earth had been soft and inviting, that no living woman could kneel so still, so unflinching, beneath lightning's rage. And more than anything, that the villagers had been too quick, far too quick, to bury the truth beneath a tale. The wind that swept through Netherwinden that evening wasn't just cold, it felt sentient, like it carried eyes, whispering secrets in a language no one dared translate. The village, ancient and coiled in its own history, braced itself beneath a bruised sky as the last traces of sunlight vanished behind the chapel ruins. The silence that followed was not peaceful, but watchful, like the stillness in the air before a long-buried truth stirs. In his modest study above the churchyard, Reverend Basil paused mid-sermon drift when he heard it, a low, mournful sound drifting through the shutters. It wasn't a scream, not quite a wail, but something more intimate than grief, like a voice trying to remember itself. Hours later, young Rosie Allerton, who had been warned countless times not to stray past the old chapel path, returned home pale and trembling, clutching not her usual skipping rope but a small wooden box wrapped in decaying velvet. Inside was a single glove, white, dainty and stained at the fingertips with something dark and dried. She said she found it near the crumbling angel statue behind Cade Cottage, a place no one had spoken of in years, not since the painter disappeared in the middle of a portrait, leaving the canvas half-finished and the subject's eyes left blank. That same night, 3 villagers claimed to see a girl, thin, barefoot, and dressed in white, wandering near the chapel's rear gate. She walked slowly, lantern in hand, her hair trailing like weeds from a riverbed, her dress soaked as if she had come straight from the grave. Inspector Hargreaves, posted nearby on unrelated duty, saw her too, or thought he did, but by the time he gave chase, only a patch of disturbed earth and a blood-marked feather remained. Then came the diary. Rosie's younger brother, chasing their dog through the underbrush, found it beneath an ancient elm, a leather-bound journal with initials. EL scorched into the cover, the pages lined in deep burgundy ink that bled slightly when touched. Inside, the entries grew more deranged with each page. I see him every night, he stands by the altar, he never blinks, he waits for me to speak his name. Miss Halewood, who had spent decades tending the village's historical archives, recognized the initials immediately. Elizabeth Lornham, a girl who vanished from the chapel during the Easter Vigil of 1912. Her disappearance had been shrouded in tragedy and shame, written off as an accident, though rumors whispered of a forbidden love, an unholy pact, and a bell that rang at midnight though no hand touched the rope. The ink in the diary, however, was inexplicably fresh. Stranger still, the chapel's bell, disused for nearly a century, rang thrice that very evening, waking the village and setting the dogs howling as if in mourning. By the next dusk the entire town pulsed with uneasy energy. A thick mist rolled in, clinging low to the cobbled streets, and at its center the girl returned. Her eyes were too large, too empty, yet filled with something ancient and terrible. She stood at the chapel gate, blood trailing from her palms, her lips slightly parted in what might have been a prayer or a curse. The villagers froze. Even the birds fell silent. And then came the sound, violin music, distant, aching, played with the sorrow of a century. It drifted not from within the chapel but from beneath it, as if the stone floor itself carried the tune from something buried alive. When the inspector stepped forward, he found her gone once more, only the oil lamp left flickering by the gate, its flames strangely undisturbed by the wind. The glove, the diary, the music, the girl, it all pointed to something older than legend, something forgotten not by time but by design. Now every child in Nether Winden is taught never to whistle after sunset, never to pick white roses after dusk, and above all never ever to speak the name Elizabeth Lornham aloud. Because some stories are not myths, they are warnings. And when the ground remembers, it does not forgive. The rain had begun softly that morning, a steady patter against the high windows of St. Elric's, cloaking the church in a hush that felt more like warning than blessing. The service had gone on as scheduled, though the pews were thinly filled and the vicar's voice wavered oddly during the second reading. At the far end of the nave, where light seldom reached and the stones still bore moss from forgotten floods, sat a newcomer, Sister Marguerite, draped in charcoal grey robes, her veil drawn low, her posture reverent to the point of stillness. She was noticed by few, though those who did speak of a chill that followed her presence, not from the air but from something that seemed to press inwards with her arrival. Miss Talbot, who'd arranged the flower vessels that morning, claimed she'd seen her enter not through the main doors but from the vestry side, unlocked apparently, though no one had left it so. When the hymn-led Kindly Light began, an old piece with ties to a tragedy no one mentioned anymore, something changed. Sister Marguerite's shoulders, until then statuesque, gave the faintest tremble. Her hands, folded in her lap, gripped one another as if the bones beneath might splinter, and though her head remained bowed, a single tear slipped from beneath the veil and traced a line down her cheek, vanishing into the woolen folds below. Miss Talbot saw it. So did Miss Henley, who sat 3 rows behind and whispered later that he'd never seen someone cry so silently. But it was not the tear that disturbed Miss Calder, the parish clerk, it was the way Sister Marguerite vanished before the final blessing, her seat empty by the time the congregation turned for the recessional. By Tuesday, murmurs circled among the church committee, not about the sister's devotion but her origins. The key to the West Wing guest quarters had been missing for years, lost, they assumed, after the sudden death of Father Giles, who'd once hosted visiting clergy in that wing. Yet the room had been found open and used, the candle stubs still warm, the bedding turned down with care, and on the writing desk, a rosary of black glass beads coiled like a serpent, one bead cracked clean through. No one had seen her enter town, no letter of introduction had been received. Reverend Holcroft admitted privately to Miss Calder that he'd simply assumed someone else had arranged her visit, that perhaps the bishop's office had forgotten to notify him. But when inquiries were made, no order claimed her, and no Sister Marguerite appeared on any registry of traveling religious. More unsettling still was what the groundskeeper found early Wednesday morning, a small crude wooden cross placed at the foot of the old yew tree behind the vestry, its bark scorched black around the base. Buried beneath the soil was a faded photograph of a young girl, face scratched out, and on the back a single line in Latin, Memini te sed tu me non vis videa, I remember you but you refused to see me. By Thursday, Sister Marguerite had not reappeared, though someone, no one knew who, lit a single taper in the sanctuary every dusk. On Friday, the bell rang at midnight, though its rope had been cut 3 decades ago. And by Sunday morning, when Reverend Holcroft looked out across the congregation, his gaze instinctively flicked to that shadowed row near the back where she'd first appeared and froze. There, on the seat's worn velvet, lay the cracked bead from the rosary, resting precisely where her hands had once folded. No footsteps had been heard, no doors opened, and yet something had been there, something that was not yet done. And though no one dared speak it aloud, many felt it in their bones, she had not come to worship, she had come to remember. It wasn't merely the disappearance that troubled Miss Marlowe, it was the eerie rhythm of it, like a verse half repeated and abruptly swallowed. Sister Callista, with her quiet steps and eyes that seemed too still for someone alive, had a way of becoming present just long enough to be remembered, then vanishing as though she had never been. The villagers might have dismissed it as piety or eccentricity, but Miss Marlowe, seasoned in reading the undercurrents of human behavior, knew better than to ignore patterns that felt rehearsed. That morning, she had spoken lightly of bees and rainfall to the baker's apprentice, yet in her mind she had been cataloguing every instance of the young sister's peculiar timing. By afternoon she had returned to St. Martin's Chapel under the polite pretense of searching for a mislaid umbrella, though the truth was she had never once in 50 years forgotten an umbrella. The vestry, cold and dim, still smelled faintly of lavender polish and old incense, and Miss Hartnell, meticulous and overzealous, watched her like a moth guarding a flame, reminding her that all the sacristy drawers were locked and inventoried. Miss Marlowe offered a pleasant nod, but her gaze drifted toward a crooked stack of neglected hymnals, and as her fingers traced along the edge, they caught on something foreign, stiff, ancient, deliberate. It was an envelope, yellowed by time but not dust, its edges crisp as though it had been hidden, not merely left behind. The ink had paled to a ghost of black, but the name still read clearly, Reverend Thomas Berrington. She held it a moment longer than needed. Berrington, she recalled, had died suddenly in the pulpit one winter's eve in '43, clutching his chest mid-sermon with a look of betrayal frozen on his face. No autopsy had followed, the war had buried more than bodies. Slipping the letter into her handbag, she let her face remain unreadable. Experience had taught her that truth often arrived dressed as coincidence. That evening, she began her inquiries, casual at first, about the defunct St.
Dandine's convent. a name that made the postmistress fumble her ledger and caused the retired gardener, Mr. Havers, to mutter, "Not again," under his breath. The convent had closed in silence just after the war's midpoint, the official story involving repairs and dwindling vocations, but whispers had always suggested something darker. A novice girl gone without goodbye, a misplaced American donation never accounted for, and a body pulled from the river with rosary beads clutched so tightly they cut into the flesh. Miss Marlowe, with the patience of one who listens not for answers but for contradictions, found what she needed in the dust-laden parish archives, a brittle newsletter from 1944 folded inside an Easter bulletin, a photograph. The sisters lined in solemn ranks outside the cloister, expressions fixed, some mournful, some guarded. One figure near the edge drew her breath short, veil askew, eyes downward, a hesitancy in the pose that mirrored Sister Callista with uncanny precision. The caption named her Sonia, Dominica novice, though the resemblance to the current Sister Callista was more than familial. It was as if time had bent back to complete a circle left unfinished. Intrigued but unsatisfied, Miss Marlowe ventured to the village outskirts, to a modest cottage where Mrs. Redding, once the convent's cook and now nearly blind but sharp as vinegar, lived in self-imposed silence. Over tea she spoke in riddles and half-finished sentences until Miss Marlowe, voice low, mentioned the name Dominica. There was a moment, a stillness so profound even the kettle seemed to hush, before the old woman muttered, "They said she was buried in the garden, but I never saw a priest come." That night, as rain lashed against the windows and the church bell inexplicably tolled once, though no hands were seen near the tower, Miss Marlowe sat at her desk and unlocked a drawer only she touched. There atop her private collection of old parish maps and sealed death notices, lay the letter. She had not yet opened it. Not from fear but from instinct. Some truths she knew did not reveal themselves until the exact moment they were ready to be heard, and others more chilling still demanded that you become part of their story just to understand why they chose to return. With eyes that missed not the slightest tremor of unease, and a presence as gentle as it was unsettling, Miss Lennox arrived again at Ashcroft Parish. Not merely a visitor bearing cordial preserves and pleasantries, but an observer cloaked in quiet investigation, whose questions, always carefully threaded between compliments and curiosity, inevitably led to the name Sister Eloise. A hush seemed to fall every time that name surfaced, like the chapel itself holding its breath. "Troubled soul," whispered Mrs. Hargrave after a long pause, the kind only filled with memory and discomfort, as if some part of her had arrived before her body ever did. Sister Eloise had appeared not through the diocesan transfer records, but from some forgotten cloister across the sea. No one quite knew where. She claimed Paris, but her accent carried deeper shadows, older echoes. Her English was precise, practiced, but occasionally faltered as if tripping over a native tongue she fought to suppress. She played the harp, badly yes, but with an aching sorrow that seemed to open old wounds in those who heard it. Often, she hummed strange lullabies behind locked doors, songs no one could place yet felt they'd known in dreams or nightmares. Most curious was her connection to the man named Mr. Alaric, a pale and silent visitor, whose appearances were rare, but always timed with the new moon. No one dared ask how she knew him, or why, after his visits, she'd be seen wandering the halls in her nightgown, speaking to corners, or scratching symbols into her diary, that the Mother Superior quietly burned without explanation. There had been rumors of gifts, heavy velvet boxes left outside the vestry, unsigned letters that made Eloise weep and tremble, and one night, after a winter storm, a chapel door left wide open with rose petals scattered in a spiral on the floor. Then came the silence. No announcement, no farewell. Her room neatly made, her harp restrung, was empty. Only a black feather too long and too fine to belong to any bird in the region lay on her pillow. Miss Lennox, saying little, walked the perimeter of the property that evening with her lantern, eyes drawn to the half-buried greenhouse. There, beneath rusted ivy and the bones of frost-killed roses, she found a hatch covered in dead vines. The narrow stone steps beneath it descended into darkness, breathing secrets. She went down alone. The air was thick, like exhaled secrets trapped for centuries, and the walls bore faint, crumbling carvings, symbols older than the chapel itself. She found an abandoned sanctum,
shattered votive candles, a broken harp string, and a cryptic phrase etched into the stone. "I was never meant to be saved." Meanwhile Colonel Wycliffe, known more for logic than legends, began to doubt the comfort of rationality. The envelope he received, marked only with a sigil of an open eye, contained no threats, only an unsettling line: "Midnight unveils what daylight denies." His dog, once calm, now growled whenever the breeze turned east, and 3 nights in a row, the chapel bell rang once, despite its mechanism being dismantled decades ago. On the 4th night, unable to bear the unknown clawing at the edges of his mind, Wycliffe ventured out under a moon hidden behind clouds. The chapel loomed like a scar against the hills, its ivy-clad arches blackened by time. As the hour struck, something stirred, barely a whisper of motion, but enough. A veiled figure glided between the broken pews, her steps fluid yet solemn, as if retracing memories not her own. She reached the altar, not to pray but to pull at the ancient stones, her hands moving with urgency and pain. Wycliffe stepped forward, and in that moment, the figure turned. Their eyes met, hers hollow, burning with a grief older than her face, and then she vanished, fleeing into the cryptic dark, her veil snagging on the altar, and tearing like mist. He followed but reached only silence. In her place, he found a rosary half buried in the mud, its crucifix blackened, its beads strung with damp earth, and beneath it, clear as if knelt there minutes ago, were twin impressions of knees. The next morning, the caretaker's cottage door stood ajar. The postman's boy, curious and trembling, peeked inside, and ran. By the time the constable and vicar arrived, word had already spread like wildfire through the village. Sister Marjorie, long thought stable and serene, had been found collapsed across the threshold, her veil torn, her nails bloodied, from gripping the rosary that Wycliffe had recovered. Her first words, barely whispered through chattering teeth, were not prayer, but warning. She was never Sister Eloise, she was something wearing her face. Miss Lennox, standing still in the morning light that filtered like judgment through the convent windows, closed her notebook quietly. Her gaze drifted to the chapel spire, where a raven now circled, once then twice, before vanishing into the clouds. And somewhere in the underground sanctum, beneath dust and stone, something began to stir. Her breath shallow, the air in the room heavy with an unspoken tension. Sister Clare lay unconscious upon the guest bed, her pale face twisted with something beyond physical pain. The once serene woman had fallen silent, and it was clear she carried a story that the world had long been too afraid to hear. Miss Cynthia Aldrich worked feverishly to prepare a warm compress, her hands trembling with something more than just concern, while the thick silence of the room was broken only by the soft murmur of Miss Marple, who had arrived quickly, after being urgently summoned by Mrs. Weatherby. Miss Marple's gaze was deliberate as she entered, not to offer comfort but to observe. She did not speak to Clare directly, not yet, but the subtle movements of her hands, the positioning of her body, the faint scrape on her knuckles that spoke of a struggle, or perhaps something worse. These details told a far deeper story. As her eyes flicked over the room, they rested momentarily on the old rosary laid upon a folded towel, a relic of sorts, but not one from the convent. Its beads were marked with strange symbols, foreign to any English maker, and its crucifix bore an inscription, April 1941. Miss Marple's hands folded slowly in thought as her mind sifted through the pieces, weaving the threads of what was becoming a tale much darker than any ghost. It wasn't a spirit that haunted them. It was a memory, long buried, returning to claim the living. The veil which had once cloaked Clare's identity, unraveled with merciless precision. It was Miss Cynthia who, in the process of preparing a warm broth, noticed the faint traces of rouge beneath Sister Clare's chin. A faint trace, yet undeniable, a cosmetic out of place on the face of one who had sworn off vanity. Questions began to stir like a storm on the horizon. A telegram was sent, and the diocesan office, polite yet visibly perplexed, replied with an unsettling answer. No Sister Clare existed among the known orders. As the day wore on, a nurse from Middleshaw Hospital arrived, and when she saw Clare's face, her breath caught in her throat. The woman in the bed was not a sister, she was Clare Mallory, once a singer of fleeting renown and questionable repute, her name appearing occasionally in the society pages of the war years, always in the company of men whose names were wrapped in mystery. Claire had been a shadow in the past, and now that shadow was coming to light. Miss Marple observed quietly from the doorway, her mind already turning the pages of a story long left untold. What had been framed as an enigmatic disappearance was now being slowly revealed as a carefully crafted deception. The villagers, quick to romanticize the idea of holiness, had equally swift judgment when faced with falsehood. A nun, no longer, a woman with hidden secrets, not just a lost soul, but one with a past far darker than anyone could have imagined. Yet Miss Marple, as ever, reserved judgment. She knew better than most that even lies were often built upon some desperate truth. When Claire Mallory, roused from her stupor, was gently questioned, she offered no resistance to the facts as they poured from her, like a dam breaking. Her voice, though faint, was steady as she spoke of a love lost to time and war. Edwin Aldridge, a man she had met in Paris during the early days of the war, had been both kind and reserved. He had given her a locket, made her promise that if anything ever happened to him, she would return something to a chapel, though he never told her exactly what or where. The promise she had made to him had weighed heavily on her heart through the years. When word of his death reached her, she had kept her grief silent, until now. Now, all these years later, she had returned not to deceive but to honor the man who had seen something in her no one else ever had. Miss Marple, still standing in the hall, thought privately that grief, buried too deeply for too long, often emerges in strange forms, ones that others mistake for deceit. It was the vicar, of all people, who found her in the church. The late evening service had just ended, and the church was nearly empty, the heavy wooden doors to the vestry locked as always. Yet there was something, a gnawing unease, a flicker of intuition that led him to the confessional. There, inside, he found her, Claire Mallory, crumpled in a way that spoke of far more than exhaustion. Her veil, once worn to shield her identity, now lay strangled around her neck, its fabric twisted with an almost cruel precision. Her eyes, though half closed in the light, betrayed no struggle, only a fleeting expression of recognition, yes, but not surprised. No scream had pierced the stillness, no frantic knocking on doors had been heard. By the time Constable Reed arrived, his footsteps echoing through the cold church, there was no sign of a struggle, no visible wounds, just the suffocating silence of a life that had been abruptly stilled. The clues that had been gathered over the past days pointed to something far more sinister than a mere disappearance, something far more unsettling than anyone had imagined. Yet the mystery remained. Did she die to protect a secret, or was there something darker still waiting to be uncovered? What of the rosary, the locket, the forgotten chapel? Miss Marple knew better than to assume the end had come. The veil was not the only thing that had been hiding the truth. The investigation proceeded with the methodical pace of a well-practiced routine, yet it yielded little of value. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints to give away a trespasser's identity, and no thefts, though the perpetrator had taken great care to leave nothing behind. The only clues, if they could be called such, came Miss Marple, who with her quiet observation, noticed the peculiar detail of the door's hinge, adjusted save for one side, which remained slightly ajar, an oddity, she noted, as though someone had waited there, perhaps unseen, for something or someone. This small detail, nearly invisible to anyone else, was a whisper of something far deeper. In the village, the narrative swiftly began to morph. What had initially been seen as a mysterious foreign woman became, in the eyes of the villagers, the face of deceit. The romantic figure of Sister Claire shifted into something far darker. Some whispered of blackmail, others of secrets too dangerous to reveal, but none were prepared for the unsettling truths that Miss Marple knew were bubbling just beneath the surface. She alone noticed the rosary, old and worn but strangely foreign in its design, the torn linen, bearing the faintest hint of something far older than its years, and the name Agnes, an echo from the past that wouldn't stay buried. There were things hidden, things buried too deeply, and Claire Mallory was a woman who had come to unearth them. The arrival of Inspector Cray, from Middleshire, brought with it a sense of cold pragmatism. He approached the case with the efficiency of someone accustomed to quickly cutting through the confusion of village mysteries. To him, the facts were clear. Claire had lied, had assumed a false identity, and had been searching for something hidden, valuable, something buried long ago. Her deception, he theorized, had triggered her demise. Someone had silenced her before she could reveal what she had found. His interpretation of the case was neat, wrapped in a cause and effect, with no room for the romanticism or mystery that had initially enveloped the village. Yet Miss Marple remained silent, her mind working at a different pace. She knew better than anyone that truth, when it was hiding in plain sight, arrived neatly packaged, and criminals rarely bothered with symbols or meanings beyond the immediate moment. She observed the inspector dismiss the rose theatrics and the letter to Edwin Aldridge as nothing but forgery. The inspector, so confident in his reasoning, never paused to consider the possibility that the answers were more layered, more intricate than the surface suggested. As Cray continued issuing orders, Miss Marple took her leave, quietly returning to the church, the scene of the tragedy. Alone, with only a prayer book in her hand, she moved through the sacred space with the grace of someone who knew it as well as her own home. The confessional, where the fatal incident had occurred, looked unremarkable, the wood polished, the cushions bearing faint indentations, and the door creaking open with a sound that betrayed nothing more than the passage of time. But Miss Marple's keen eyes, accustomed to the minutiae of human behavior and domestic detail, caught something that others had missed. The hinges of the confessional had been wiped recently, except for one, the lower hinge on the right side. There, hidden like a secret, was a thin crescent of dust, finer than ash, almost imperceptible to the casual observer. It clung to the edge, where a cloth had failed to reach, and it told Miss Marple everything she needed to know. Someone had opened the confessional from the inside, not as part of the regular cleaning process, but with deliberate intent. The dust was undisturbed enough to suggest that the action had been carried out carefully, with patience, and at a specific moment. Someone had been waiting there, hidden, listening, perhaps waiting for a certain person or a certain confession. The realization sent a shiver down her spine, though she spoke nothing of it. She simply left the church, knowing that sometimes it was the most subtle of details, the ones no one else would notice, that held the unraveling the truth. As the days passed, the village of Nether Hatchington, filled with whispers of certainty, found itself swarming with the energy of a community desperate for answers. What had started as the tale of a foreign nun had evolved into a full-blown drama, dissected in the local cafes, gardens, and even in the Women's Guild rehearsals. Speculation ran rampant. Some insisted that Claire had been blackmailing someone powerful, others claimed that she had come in search of a hidden fortune or a long-lost inheritance. The more colorful members of the village threw around theories of espionage, with Mrs. Weatherby especially enthusiastic about the idea. "Mark my words," she declared with absolute certainty, always one foreigner in a village, hiding behind a clarinet case. But the most persistent theory, one that lingered in the corners of conversation, was the darkest of them all. It was not that Claire Mallory had assumed the identity of Sister Agnes, but that she had in some way returned, changed, veiled and altered by the years, but with the same haunting presence. Sister Agnes had come back, not impersonating her, but returning from the past, her secrets veiled beneath the surface, and a dangerous truth buried too deep for anyone to uncover without paying a terrible price. The mystery that had begun as a whisper quickly grew into an echo, reverberating through the narrow streets of Nether Hatchington. With each passing day, the village seemed more divided, the air thick with the scent of intrigue. The once small and innocent rumor that Claire Mallory resembled the long-lost Sister Agnes had taken root like an uncontrollable fire, sparking debates that fueled division. Some villagers, eager to cling to a sense of order and certainty, believed that the resemblance was too uncanny to be mere coincidence. Others, more cautious and skeptical, suggested that Miss Marple herself might be stoking the flames of doubt with her cryptic silences, playing her role as the puzzle maker in this twisted game. Miss Marple, ever composed, did not offer her opinion. She knew the value of keeping her cards close to her chest. Instead, she watched as the villagers fell into two distinct camps, those who clung to the simple narrative of a vanished novice, and those who believed in the sordid tale of a cabaret singer's deceit. What was becoming clear, however, was that the villagers were more comfortable with one story over the other, preferring the illusion of purity and innocence over the complexity of a truth that threatened to upend their small, ordered world. Miss Marple could not help but notice the dangerous simplicity of it all. It was an instinct to categorize, to settle on one version of events, that had kept the village blind to the more unsettling truths hidden beneath the surface. They had allowed themselves to believe the falsehoods, rejecting the uncomfortable complexities in favor of a lie that could be easily understood. The very same instinct, she thought, was likely what had allowed the darker secrets of the past to be buried so deeply. Later that week, when the opportunity arose, Miss Marple made her way to the forgotten back room of the church. The room, once used by the convent's visitors and guests, had long been ignored, its contents gathering dust in the quiet corner of the sacred space. Among the decaying certificates and framed notices, Miss Marple found what she had long suspected was hidden, an old portrait. Water-stained and poorly reframed, the portrait depicted a group of nuns in their religious habit, gathered together in solemn commemoration of a donor. But it was the bottom of the frame that caught Miss Marple's attention. Where a brass nameplate should have been, there was nothing but the twisted remnants of 2 screws and a faint rectangle of lighter wood. It was clear that the plaque had been deliberately removed, not lost or misplaced, but taken with care, erased. The act was not one of carelessness, but rather of intent. Someone had wanted Sister Agnes to be forgotten. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that her memory was wiped clean from the walls of the church. Miss Marple stood for a long moment, her fingers lingering on the frame, as the weight of this realization settled over her. The question, she knew, was no longer just about who Claire Mallory was. It was about who Sister Agnes had been, and what she had threatened to become. What had she known, and more importantly, who had gone to such extremes to bury her story, to rewrite history itself? Unable to let the question go, Miss Marple turned her attention to the parish's financial records from the war years. She asked Cynthia, the ever-obliging parish secretary, if she might see the books for the period between April 1940 and June 1941. Cynthia, though mildly curious, agreed, and fetched the records from the locked drawer beneath the vicar's desk. The books were meticulously kept, every entry neat and precise, documenting the donations, repairs, and charitable distributions made by the parish. However, when Miss Marple turned to the pages covering the convent's final year, her heart skipped a beat. 2 pages were missing, not torn, not misplaced, but neatly and deliberately excised. The edges were clean, the stubs exact, no hint of carelessness, no indication that they had been lost. The absence was purposeful, a quiet and intentional act. What troubled Miss Marple most was not the missing pages, but the certainty that someone had wanted those records gone long before Claire Mallory arrived in the village. Someone had erased a record, not just of financial transactions, but of presence, of names, of actions, of decisions that might have revealed something darker beneath the surface. What had been hidden, she realized, was more than just money. It was a record of betrayal. A record of those who had followed Sister Agnes, those who had come after her, seeking something that had been left behind. Miss Marple's thoughts then turned to Edwin Aldridge, the vicar's younger brother. A quiet, reserved man, Edwin had always been more interested in books than in sermons. During the war, he had joined a government bureau so secretive that its very name seemed to disappear when spoken aloud. His death in 1941, attributed to a bombing raid, had been reported without fanfare, folded quickly into the collective memory of the village. Yet, Miss Marple knew, there had always been whispers. Whispers about Edwin's unusual absences, his curious attachment to the convent, and his private visits to St. Winter's Chapel. It was said, in hushed tones, that he had frequented the chapel not as a man of faith, but as someone seeking something far more elusive. It was also said that his conversations there were not with the vicar or the Mother Superior, but with Sister Agnes herself. Miss Marple recalled the way Edwin had lingered at the back of the church, his gaze not on the altar, but on the side aisle, where the novices would enter in procession. There had been something wistful in his expression, a look of longing and loss. It was the kind of look one might have, if they had lost something not once but twice. And now, all these years later, someone else had returned to the village, carrying with them the same sorrow, the same shadow. Miss Marple knew that the threads of the past had not been severed. They were still there, still weaving their way through the present. The village had tried to bury Edwin Aldridge's death, to distance it from the events that had transpired at the convent, but the connections were still there, lurking beneath the surface. What had been lost in the past was now resurfacing, and with it came the dangerous truth that had been buried so carefully, so intentionally. Miss Marple was more certain than ever. The secrets of Sister Agnes were not just her own. They had entangled the lives of many, and they were now drawing ever closer to the surface, threatening to break free and unravel the entire village. The room, untouched by time or the dust of passing years, stood as a quiet testament to the past, more a relic of sentiment than practicality, as Miss Cynthia had once remarked. Still, it brought her brother comfort, and that alone seemed to preserve its order. The books, arranged meticulously as Edwin had left them, remained shelved, a subtle reflection of his precise and methodical nature. The wardrobe, too, stood as it had, containing a coat with the tarnished buttons of wartime, its fabric faded by the years, yet still holding traces of its owner. But Miss Marple, ever the patient observer, sought not just the visible traces, but the hidden corners, the small pieces of history left behind, not in haste but with purpose. This was no act of idle rummaging, nor was it driven by a morbid curiosity. It was the work of one who knew that people leave fragments of themselves, tucked away in forgotten spaces, small clues, often overlooked, but telling nonetheless. As she sifted through the carefully stacked religious texts, a small well-worn volume of Psalms caught her attention. Its leather binding had split slightly, and when her fingers brushed over the edges, something unusual, something foreign, caught her touch. Beneath the lining, concealed within the hollowed-out spine, she discovered it, an old silver locket, wrapped with delicate care in a linen handkerchief. The cloth, carefully folded, had preserved it, and Miss Marple unfolded it with deliberate care. As the linen unfolded, she held the locket in her palm, its delicate craftsmanship speaking of a time long past. The clasp, worn smooth with use, indicated it was no mere trinket, but something of significance. It had not been given away, but kept, carefully hidden. There was no doubt in Miss Marple's mind. Edwin Aldridge had loved someone, not from a distance, not in some theoretical way, but with the quiet intensity of a man who could never speak of it aloud. He had loved someone, and in his silence, he had hidden her away in memory and in prayer. Time had preserved a single photograph within the locket, small sepia-toned, its edges curling with age. It was the image of a woman, unmistakable in her features, though younger, less composed. Her hair, wild and loose around her shoulders, spoke of a different time, a different life. Claire Mallory. It was her. Miss Marple knew it instantly. The locket was not simply a token of affection, it was a symbol of a secret, preserved in time. On the inner lid of the locket, etched in looping French script, was a phrase, pour toujours mon cœur, forever my heart. Miss Marple read the words slowly, almost reverently, her mind turning over their meaning. This was no casual declaration, no fleeting affection. This was a message of deep, unspoken devotion. The language was not of flirtation or passing fancy, but of someone who had belonged to someone else in silence. Promise. The locket had been kept, not discnom, and in its concealment, Miss Marple saw the shape of a desperate compromise, one that had never been meant for the world to know. Edwin Aldridge had not lived long enough to explain. Claire Mallory had returned too late to forgive. With a steady hand, Miss Marple closed the locket, returning it to its protective cloth. The secrets it contained had never been meant for others, but someone, somewhere, had ensured that it would be found. The next step took her to Miss Peabody, the village seamstress, known for her quiet understanding, and for keeping countless confidences over the years. Miss Peabody, though she hadn't thought of Edwin Aldridge in ages, was quick to recall the man when Miss Marple arrived, under the pretense of mending a lace collar. As she stitched, the old woman's memory stirred. Yes, he came to me just before the raids, she recalled, her fingers moving deftly over the fabric. Wanted something embroidered, not a wedding veil. No, it wasn't that. It was a nun's veil, made from fine muslin, with a lace border, Miss Peabody smiled faintly at the memory. It took me 3 evenings to finish it, and he said it was a gift, though he never told me for whom. There had been no receipt, no formal order, just a quiet request, specific, almost secretive. The initials had been embroidered into the fabric, hidden in delicate, almost imperceptible stitching. As Miss Peabody recounted the details, the fine lace, the length of the veil, Miss Marple's mind pieced the puzzle together. Edwin had not planned a deception. No, he had planned a tribute, or perhaps an escape. The veil had not been meant to deceive, but to honor, to protect. Someone, somewhere, had worn it years later, not as a memory, but as a disguise. And as Miss Marple knew well, disguises always concealed more than just a face. It was not the veil itself that told the story, but how it had been worn, the weight of what it hid. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Claire Mallory, who had entered the village under the guise of Sister Claire. She had worn the veil, not just as a symbol of her religious calling, but as a mask to shield herself from a past that had caught up with her, a past entwined with Edwin Aldrich. The locket, the veil, the whispered conversations, the hidden love, everything now pointed to one thing. A secret, buried deep, one that had festered for years, waiting for the right moment to surface. The question now was no longer who Claire Mallory was, but who she had been. And Miss Marple, ever watchful, knew that the tangled threads of the past were only beginning to unravel, and with them the dangerous truths that had been hidden for far too long. Claire Mallory, her fingers delicately adjusting the fabric of the veil, moved with a quiet, almost unconscious grace, each fold at the nape of her neck, held as if she had done it 1,000 times before. These were no borrowed gestures, they were instinct, habits forged through years of unseen repetition. Yet as Miss Marple observed, Claire had never been a nun, and the question that gnawed at her was one of inheritance. This veil, more than a mere item of clothing, had been passed down, preserved not just for its beauty, but for something deeper, something far more dangerous. It had not come from a wardrobe, it had come from memory. A memory, once wrapped in Edwin Aldrich's silent grief, had re-emerged not as a quiet tribute, but as a threat. The veil, worn in secrecy, had become an object of fear. It was not Claire's pretense that had condemned her, but the veil itself, this garment, sewn in silence, had carried with it a hidden history, a history long buried, and now unearthed. Miss Marple, ever astute, folded her hands, reflecting on a truth she had long known. Some lies are never spoken aloud. They are stitched into the fabric of lives, worn and carried until someone dares to unravel them. With quiet resolve, Miss Marple requested the veil be examined, presenting it as if merely in need of mending, a task which Miss Cynthia readily accepted. Yet it was not the tear that Miss Marple sought to fix, but something far more elusive. Along the inner hem of the veil, barely visible to the untrained eye, Miss Marple noticed a series of odd, irregular stitches, short, uneven, and suspiciously out of place. To most it would have seemed an imperfection, but to her it was a message. She traced it with her crochet hook, murmuring the translation to herself, Agnes. It was not a name or a dedication, it was a person embedded into the fabric with a precision that could not be ignored. Agnes. The name resided there, as permanent as if etched in stone, a quiet tribute, or a desperate protection. Miss Marple let the veil rest in her lap, her gaze fixed on the cold hearth as she pondered the lengths someone had gone to in order to preserve or erase Agnes's memory. And now, that memory was speaking once more. Later, during a quiet visit to the vicar's parlor, Miss Marple found the moment she had been waiting for. The modest setting was perfect for the unveiling of hidden truths, truths that preferred to come softly. As the vicar poured tea, his hands steady but wearied by recent burdens, Miss Marple took her time, stirring her tea slowly, speaking not as an interrogation, but as a gentle reflection. She spoke of Edwin Aldrich, his quiet nature, his reserved demeanor, and mentioned the locket, the veil, the photograph, and the inscription, not as accusations but as pieces of a sorrowful puzzle. When she mentioned Agnes, she saw the brief hesitation in the vicar's movements, the pause before the spoon continued its rhythm. Miss Marple had expected this. She did not mention Claire Mallory until the very end, almost as an afterthought. She wore Agnes's memory, Miss Marple said softly, but Edwin never truly loved her. Not the way he loved Agnes. There was no anger in the vicar's response, just a long-waited silence. He nodded slowly, as though the weight of the years had finally caught up with him. Yes, Edwin loved Agnes, he admitted, his voice quiet, filled with the reluctant wisdom of a man who had seen too much. The kind of love that men like Edwin carry in silence, heavy and unspoken, but he never said it aloud. Their connection, though hidden, was real, but it was also inconvenient. The vicar paused, the words lingering in the air. The church had rules, the village had expectations, Agnes had broken one, and Edwin the other, and someone made sure they paid the price for it. The vicar's confession was a quiet one, weighed down by guilt and memory. Miss Marple's suspicions had been correct. Edwin had planned to leave, not out of shame, but in search of freedom. He had secured work abroad, and intended to take Agnes with him, to leave the constraints of the village, and the expectations of a society that could never understand. But someone had seen the love between them, had seen the danger it posed, and had made sure their plans would never come to fruition. The veil, the locket, the names stitched into the fabric, these were not just remnants of a past love, they were the markers of a story buried deep, one that had been carefully erased, yet never truly forgotten. And now, the truth was rising, like a tide that could not be held back, and with it, the price that would finally be paid for secrets long kept. Agnes had never been the scandalous figure some claimed her to be. Pregnancy or theft had never been her burden. No, her true crime was far more profound. She had chosen love, and in doing so she had defied the strict sacred walls of both the convent and village expectation, and that choice, made in the stillness of her own heart, had cost her everything. Before she could escape into the life that was to be, before she and Edwin could disappear quietly into the future they had secretly planned, an anonymous letter had reached the Mother Superior. A letter containing just enough detail to stir doubt and suspicion, enough to make Agnes a target. That very night, Agnes had been locked away, confined to her quarters while Edwin, summoned to London the next morning, was killed in an air raid, a loss that seemed more cruelly timed than fate could have allowed. Agnes, overwhelmed by grief, shame, or perhaps something darker, disappeared soon after. Whether by her own hand or someone else's, no one ever knew for sure. The vicar's parlour, in its quiet formality, bore witness to Miss Marple's understanding of the depth of betrayal that had taken place. As she considered the intricacies of guilt, it was never malice that drove the hand of harm, but the twisted shape of love, distorted by fear and control. Betrayal, as Miss Marple knew all too well, often masqueraded as righteousness, and within the confines of the vicar's house, that thread of deception had been pulled long ago, unraveling lives in its wake. But this betrayal had not been born of ill will, it had been the result of a twisted belief that someone was doing what was best, preserving a name, protecting a faith, guarding a future. The letter, though seemingly anonymous, could not have been written by a stranger. It contained too much knowledge, too many intimate details. The veil, the late-night meetings, the quiet plans that had been so carefully observed. The letter had been written by someone who had been watching, someone who had known too much, and who believed their intervention would preserve the delicate balance they imagined would save everything. But in doing so, they had set in motion a tragedy far worse than any scandal. They had made certain both Edwin and Agnes would be lost to the world. Miss Marple understood that the most dangerous betrayals were those committed in the name of order, of preserving a status quo that could never last. Now, with Claire Mallory's tragic death, the silence that had buried the past for so long had returned, echoing like a forgotten whisper. Whoever had once intervened had done so again, not to stop the scandal, but to ensure it never resurfaced. And in doing so, they had buried something far darker than they had ever intended. Every village, Miss Marple knew, had its quiet keepers of secrets, the ones who spoke little, and said less. In Nether Hatchington, that role belonged without question to Mrs. Littimore, the vicar's housekeeper, who had loyally served the Aldridge family for over 30 years. It was she who, Miss Marple observed, had shown the signs of long-held sorrow, the tightness of her mouth when Agnes's name was mentioned, the rustling of linen, when Edwin's belongings were brought up. Miss Littimore had been with the Aldridges through the war, never leaving her post, and it was she who had served tea to Agnes, ironed Edwin's shirts, and with quiet vigilance, kept watch over the delicate dynamics of the household. Miss Marple did not accuse, she simply reflected on how painful it must have been to love someone in silence, to witness their affections shift elsewhere, to be relegated to the margins of someone else's life. How unbearable it must have been to see Edwin fall not for a suitable parish girl, but for a novice, a woman whose very presence seemed to stir unease in those around her. Mrs. Littimore had not acted from hate but from wounded devotion, and though that wound had been tended to, it had festered in silence, grown deeper, until it had become destroying everything. That, Miss Marple realized, was the true danger. The final confirmation came not through confrontation, but through a discovery made on a quiet walk through the vicarage's storage room. There, beneath a stack of unused hymnals, Miss Marple found a small wooden box, its contents forgotten by time. Inside, among old altar cloths, and a tarnished brass candle snuffer, was a velvet-bound notebook filled with outdated dedications. But what caught Miss Marple's attention most of all, was a small brass plaque, unpolished and worn, wrapped in faded tissue. Its engraving was unmistakable, Sister Agnes 1940. The screw holes told their own story. This plaque had once been affixed to the commemorative board at St. Winfrid's Church, the same one now conspicuously empty, where Agnes's name should have been. In that moment, Miss Marple understood. It had never been a simple matter of misplaced affection or misplaced loyalty. It was the thread of an old secret, one that had been buried with Agnes, but now refused to stay buried. The past had not been forgotten. It had only been waiting for the right moment to return. The room was heavy with the weight of untold truths, a silence that clung to the air as tightly as the curtains drawn across the windows. Miss Marple stood before them, her gaze unwavering, as she examined each face in turn, reading more than just the obvious. The vicar, pale and lost in thought, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of his chair, a man undone by secrets he could not control. Mrs. Littimore standing stiffly beside the tea trolley, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes avoiding the scrutiny of those around her, yet beneath her composure lay a sorrow deeper than anything she could mask. Inspector Cray, though skeptical of the whole affair, had agreed to this gathering, his arms folded across his chest, ready to dismiss whatever he could not explain. And then there was Miss Marple, not a figure of accusation, but of quiet resolve, her voice gentle yet filled with the weight of years spent observing the unspoken dynamics of human lives. She began as always with a story, a thread pulled from the tapestry of time. The name Agnes Aldridge, a name that had once been whispered with reverence, now sat like a shadow in the room. Agnes, who had once been loved and adored, had disappeared long ago, her name erased from every memory, her life rewritten in the image of a lie. Miss Marple spoke softly, tracing the remnants of Agnes's presence, from the locket hidden away in Edwin's psalter to the embroidered veil that had been so carefully removed and hidden beneath layers of silence. Each piece, Miss Marple explained, had not been a part of some elaborate deception, but rather a symbol of a life lost and a truth buried deep beneath the surface. Claire Mallory, whose return under the guise of a novice had sparked suspicion, had not come to deceive, but to reclaim what had been taken from Agnes. She had come not as a thief of identities, but as a woman bound by love and grief, driven by a promise made in the final moments of Agnes's life. Claire had not sought to impersonate Agnes, she had come to protect her memory, to restore what had been taken from her. The veil, Miss Marple explained, had not been a mockery, but a plea to be remembered, to have her love acknowledged, to have the world believe in what had once been real. Mrs. Littimore, standing silently, had heard these words before. She had seen the path that had led them here, the quiet choices she had made in the shadows of her devotion. Her loyalty had once been the driving force behind her actions, but loyalty, Miss Marple knew, could be a double-edged sword. The housekeeper had not acted out of malice, but from a deep, unspoken love that had been warped over time, twisted by the weight of secrets too heavy to carry. The truth of Agnes's disappearance had been hidden beneath layers of guilt and regret, a truth that Claire Mallory had uncovered, not to disgrace those who had buried it, but to heal the wounds left by silence. Agnes, she explained, had not fled in shame as many had believed. No, Agnes had died in an air raid, far from home, on the outskirts of Paris, buried beneath rubble with no name to mark her resting place, no prayers to sanctify her departure. Claire had been with her in those final moments, had held her hand as the world around them fell apart, and had whispered a promise that the world had not been able to hear. That promise was not one of salvation, but one of devotion, a devotion that transcended religion, transcended duty. It was a devotion to a love that had been buried beneath lies and forgotten names. Miss Marple paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle in the room. Claire Mallory had not returned to seek vengeance. She had come to bear witness to Agnes's truth, to walk in her footsteps, and to ensure that her love would not be erased again. Mrs. Littimore, who had been so silent for so long, shifted ever so slightly. Her eyes were not filled with defiance, but with the quiet grief of someone who had once believed that preserving a lie was an act of love. And now, standing here, faced with the truth, she understood that the lie had never protected anyone. It had only delayed the inevitable, the unearthing of what had been buried for too long. In the stillness of the vicarage library, Miss Marple had not been the accuser, but the keeper of truths too painful to be forgotten. And in the quiet, the truth had come to light, as undeniable as the fading of a long-forgotten memory into the present. The past, with all its secrets and betrayals, had refused to stay buried. The vicarage library seemed to hold its breath, a stillness heavy in the air as Miss Marple's words reverberated through the room like a slow, deliberate tolling bell. The truth had become too much to bear for some, and it had become unbearable for one in particular. Mrs. Littimore, whose quiet devotion to the past had woven a tangled web of secrets too intricate to untangle. The war, she knew, had buried more than just bodies. It had buried histories, promises, and choices